Hi everyone, it's your host Mavish, and I'm so excited to bring this week's episode to you. Today I have an old friend of mine. We went to school together and I'm so grateful to have been able to keep in touch with her since graduating. She's smart, talented, and as a poet she has a way with words. Without further ado, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Tasia. I'm glad to be here. So I'm 22, I'll be 23 in March, and my background, my mom's side is Indian and Trinidadian, and my dad's side's Dominican and Guyanese, and I was born in Toronto.
For anyone who may not be familiar with where those countries are located, could you give us like a general geographical area?
Definitely, so most of those are the Caribbean islands. Dominica is not the Dominican Republic, it's just Dominica, so they speak French Creole there, and geographically, I'm actually not sure where that's from, but Guyana I know is closer to Venezuela, and then Trinidad I think is on the opposite side, but West Indies.
We've had some Caribbean guests in the past, and my next question is usually what language is spoken in that area. Mostly what I've heard back is Patois. Is that true for you as well, or are there different languages from that area? And also if you can speak any of them.
Unfortunately, I only speak English. But yeah, so we don't really call it patois in Trinidad or Guyana or Dominica. It's just broken English. And then we also speak a bit of French, Creole. It'll be different from the French that you're used to hearing either here or in France. And then Spanish. And then we have a lot of subcultures and ethnicities in these islands because everyone just sort of immigrated there throughout the years. So there are groups that speak Chinese or Hindi. So there's a lot of different languages that are in the Caribbean that are spoken there. Only speak English though.
Oh wow, I had no idea. That sounds a bit like Canada. We have so many languages spoken here too.
Growing up, I was told, there's a lot of Chinese immigrants actually in Trinidad, and we have a great uncle actually who is of Chinese descent.
Oh wow, so very mixed background then.
Yeah.
Alright, well I know you said that you only speak English, but would you happen to know any word in any of those languages that you just mentioned, even if it's just one?
What's funny is I went to a school in grade 3, and instead of learning the typical French and English, we learned Spanish. So I know basic hola, ¿cómo estás? Spanish, nothing to really get me around and survive. And then French, of course, I remember the foundations of the language, learning that through school. Bonjour, je m'appelle Tasia. That's definitely something I am trying to learn and get into because I would like to expand my speaking palette in that manner.
So, hola, ¿cómo estás? What does that translate to?
Hi, how are you?
Okay. And then all the French stuff you said, I remember, but for anyone that doesn't know.
Hi, and then my name is Tasia.
For me, one thing that I learned in French that I just cannot forget is puis-je aller aux toilettes?
Oh gosh, right? The one thing that we have to know.
And for anyone that doesn't know, that means, may I please go to the bathroom?
You're such a shared experience in Canada. Oh my goodness.
So you mentioned that you were born here. Were your parents also born here, or did they immigrate to Canada?
Yeah, actually, both my parents were born here. My grandparents immigrated to Canada way back in the 60s, or it was a long time ago. My grandma actually had immigrated to the US first and then came over to Canada when she was 14. She was very young. And then my grandpa, he was, I would say, at least in his 20s. They came by themselves. They weren't together when they immigrated to this country, but they had met here.
Oh, wow. So lots of generations have been living here then.
Yeah.
Have you ever spoken with your grandparents about their experience moving to Canada?
Yeah, they've told me stories about what it was like for them. My grandma actually came here all by herself, so she was alone and she was working for a family as sort of like a nanny in the States, and then she came here, met my grandpa, and they started their lives together. As for that transition from coming to a different country and being here, it was a lot different back then, especially, coming from a hot place to here where it's like freezing cold, like 6 months out of the year. But they really did keep the culture and shared it with their children, my aunts and my mom, and then that's been passed down. I would say though, the main thing was music. That's been very instilled throughout our childhood.
So clearly, your grandparents were able to pass down some parts of their culture to eventually this third generation. Do you feel like you feel connected to your grandparents' cultures, or do you feel more connected to Canadian culture, or are you like a combination? Where would you say you stand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm a little ashamed to say, but I do not feel that connected to the culture of my grandparents. Just because growing up, I was more immersed in Canadian culture. Like, I grew up in Toronto. I grew up watching Canadian TV, American TV, and a lot of the things we watched as children, like we did watch a lot of Bollywood movies growing up, but I wouldn't say that's more about Caribbean culture. That would be more stemmed from India, and then we incorporate those bits from that culture into ours. That happens a lot in the West Indies. I've noticed that throughout the years of my life, I've identified more with Canadian culture, and then just being so busy all the time, work and school, not really getting that downtime to spend and immerse myself within the knowledge that, my grandparents have.
Well, I would say there's no need to feel ashamed about that. I mean, it wasn't in your control, where you grew up. I mean, I feel this for myself as well because my parents were immigrants, but I grew up here, and growing up, it felt wrong to not associate with my background. But I feel like as I'm having these conversations with people and we're, discussing culture and growing up here, we've kind of created a new culture for ourselves here, and we didn't have much guidance on how to navigate two different cultures, one that you're living in at home, one outside of home. So don't feel ashamed. There's a lot of people just like you who have the exact same experience.
Thank you.
Which area of Toronto did you grow up in?
We moved around a lot as kids. The place we had stayed the longest, where I developed most of my younger memories, would be in North York, that Don Mills, Van Horn area, where I had gone and completed my elementary and then middle school and then high school.
Okay, so do you remember growing up what school was like for you as someone of so many different backgrounds?
Yeah, definitely. I guess the major thing is that people would treat me like I'm exotic, which was always very strange to me because they would ask, where are you from? You're so pretty. And then it's like, oh, okay, and I tell them my parents are from so-and-so. And then it'd be like, you're so different. That's so exotic. And it was just very strange comments to the point where in high school, actually, I started to become aware of different terminology. And I actually felt like a fetish, if that makes sense. People were so very obsessed with these characteristics and these traits based on my background. And it was very weird. It was very weird.
That is horrible. I'm so sorry you had to go through that again. But as a child, that is just a whole different thing to be navigating.
It is. It is strange. Yeah. And then especially there'd be a lot of comments about how much they love my hair and then wanting to touch it. That's actually a shared experience amongst, I would say, people with curly hair in general, but as well as I hear this a lot from the Black community, where people are fascinated with the texture of our hair. So that was another thing that I experienced a lot growing up.
And were there a lot of Black kids with you growing up, or would you say you were a minority in your school?
Yeah, there weren't a lot of Black kids, actually. I think there were 4 others in my class, and then for the entire school, I'm not really sure, but I don't remember really growing up with a lot of other Black kids.
As you were growing up feeling like you were being treated differently, did you feel like this made you feel like you were less Canadian or you didn't belong in Canada?
Oh, wow. I question constantly what it even means to be a Canadian. What is that central part of the identity? They talk so much about how it's a melting pot. There's so many different cultures here. And then you sit down to yourself. And for me, growing up, it's I always thought that being Canadian meant being white. And I had felt that a bit in schools and just engaging with the world. When people are asking you, oh, where are you from? And you tell them, oh, I'm from Canada. They're like, yeah, but where are you really from? And it's I'm really from Canada. I'm not lying. It's feeling that exclusion. But then when you talk to family back home, they're like, oh, you're Canadian. You're not Trini. So there was always sort of that jump back and forth.
So what would you say now, as a 22-year-old Tasia, you feel what it means to be Canadian?
Oh, wow, that's... I knew that was going to be the follow-up question, and I don't have an answer. I know that diversity is a huge part of being Canadian, and I love walking outside and just seeing so many different types of people, not seeing only white people. I haven't been so focused on identity, really. I think just in my personal life, my main focus has been building who I am. It's not central to an ethnicity or a nationality. It's more spiritual for me. I'm not saying oh my God, I'm not Canadian, but yeah, yeah, it's not something that I've really sat down and thought about.
Yeah, totally. You and I both. We're still young, so there's a lot of
Hmm.
identity work to do. We have our
Uh-huh.
lives ahead of us. But I wanted to jump back to what you were mentioning about being treated differently and quote unquote exotically when you were
Hmm.
younger.
Yeah.
Did you feel like people around you were noticing this? Did they take any action against it?
No, definitely not. I think at that age, people didn't really say, hey, why would you say that? That's wrong or whatever. Especially when it came to guys or whatever. Like, they could just kind of say what they wanted to you, and then other guys would be like, yeah, okay. Or they just won't say anything. Even I noticed adults, though, they would not necessarily say things like, you're exotic, but they would intensify the way they speak about my beauty in relation to where I was from. And it always felt really wrong and weird. Even to this day, there have been people that are older than me that make those kinds of comments about the way that I look in relation to where I'm from. Or I don't necessarily think it has to do with age, more so just ignorance, and then the way that they were brought up and taught that what they can say is okay and not really being called out on it. And then what does it mean for me to call them out, you know?
Yeah. What kind of adults are we talking about here? Were these teachers? Were these neighbors?
Mostly like family, friends. I hadn't had that experience with a teacher. And actually, when I was younger, I don't think I really ever went to a teacher about anything that I felt because I never understood what's the purpose, what's the point. I internalized it. That's what the problem was.
Yeah, internalized racism is such a huge thing, but I feel like people
Hmm.
don't talk about it because it's internal.
Yeah, no, definitely. Sometimes you don't really know how to open that door.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think that this problem is something that just you faced, or do you think that there are other kids out there like you who might be going through the same thing in Toronto?
Oh, definitely. This is not just a me thing. Yeah, no, this is completely a shared experience. And not even just being a Black Caribbean woman, but friends that are Asian descent, South Asian descent, have experienced these kinds of things. So it's a widely shared experience.
What's something you feel could be done to help prevent this?
I think addressing it the moment that it arises and letting the people who experience it know that they can come forward with it and that they don't need to keep it to themselves. You know, there's no punishment for speaking up for yourself, really creating those kinds of open spaces, especially at a young age. Because if we don't start that type of education when you're younger, then when you're older, it's harder to change that mindset.
Yeah, it's so crazy to me because I remember, at least for me growing up, there would be these big assemblies. They would invite
Mm,
someone who would come and do this big presentation on racism, and someone would come talk about cyberbullying. I remember it was a huge thing. But
mm,
I don't know if these were more uncomfortable situations for them or what, but they were always almost taboo. They
mm.
refused to address them, speak about them, and in a way that just let these things slide. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, no, I definitely agree. And I think their approach toward those assemblies, they were pushed on you to a point where you didn't want to participate in it. And people tend not to care, right? Like when they're being forced to have to talk about something, or let's say it's the person who's making these comments, and then that's why we've got this big assembly. They're not going to want to listen to it. It needs to be individual. People have to want to have that change in themselves in order for it to occur. A lot of those assemblies, it's not like people really ever paid attention to them. And so I think that's why they continue to happen, is just because there was no growth. I couldn't really say on a larger scale what's going to change this way that people talk and think and act, but starting small with a conversation generally does do a lot more.
For sure. More one-on-one, smaller conversations rather than just one big presentation would help.
Yeah, that's what I think personally. Like, I was talking to someone in the LGBTQ community, and I had never understood this issue beforehand, but then having that one-on-one conversation gave a lot more insight into the way that they are viewed and challenges they face. Having that conversation with an actual person one-on-one and being to understand the issue helps a lot more than these sort of like, oh, sit down for this assembly, you're going to listen to this.
As you were talking about this, I just remembered this post about this one man who apparently converted several members of the KKK by sitting down and having a conversation with them. As those members of the KKK would speak with this person, would realize that, wait, Black people really aren't that bad. And then they would eventually leave the group. One conversation can go a lot further than a mass group gathering.
Exactly. Sometimes the message can get lost when you've got this mass amount of people versus having that one-on-one.
So I was wondering, because you have such a diverse culture, I know that in our North York schools, there would often be cultural days and cultural awareness programs. Did you feel like your cultures were represented, or did you feel like you didn't really see yourself in those events?
Yeah, never. I don't ever recall seeing anything for Trinidad, Guyana, or Dominica. Sometimes I would see things for India, but for me, it's a little harder to relate to that cultural side of myself just because my family's West Indian and they did come from India, but I don't know as much about that as I would the Caribbean culture. I mean, a lot of people don't even know about Dominica. Anytime I say it, they just assume I'm from the Dominican Republic, and I'm like, no, my God, we're our own people. I think there could be a lot more toward that. Also on that, I don't ever recall meeting a lot of other people who were from the same places that I was. I've met like 2 Trinidadian people throughout my entire childhood in school.
What about in the workplace or outside of school growing up? Did you start seeing more representation, or was it pretty much the same?
In the workplace, I would say it was the same. There was not a lot of people from where I was from, and then when it came to those kinds of work events, there was nothing really culturally diverse about them. It was more just like a, let's celebrate making our Christmas sales. And then I guess in the real world, just events in general, there's nothing really I can say I recall except for like Caravana.
Do you feel like Caravana is a proper representation of your culture?
Even growing up as a child, I never understood what Caravana was about because when I would see it, and this is not to disrespect the people that do it or put the work in to create this event, but I never saw how that could possibly represent the culture as a whole. You know, the costumes are great, they're beautiful. I love that people are coming together and dancing and eating, but I just never understood what that really meant for Trinidad or for Guyana. Like, what was this really celebrating apart from people just kind of dancing half naked? So not to be vulgar, but yeah, no, I don't think that it's a representation at all.
We've talked about in the past how it seems to be almost hypersexualized, and
Yes.
a lot of the people who attend or look forward to attending tend to say they're looking forward to it just for that reason.
No, exactly. I think I overheard a coworker saying that he was looking forward to going and getting danced on, and it was so off-putting for me because I think the heart of the culture really got lost in whatever the event is now. So to hear that is just disappointing.
Definitely.
As Caribbean women, I think we get sexualized a lot, and really just anyone who's not part of the Western world, I think our women do get hypersexualized, is very unfortunate.
Yeah, that was exactly the next one I was gonna say, because I understand, the podcast usually talks about cultural backgrounds, but being a woman is kind of being part of a marginalized community too. But a lot of the experiences that women go through are brushed under the rug and no one really lets anyone speak up about it. I wonder if that's one of the reasons why you and many other women like you and me went through these really weird experiences.
No, definitely. Like living in a male-dominated society, even if it's not outright said to you that you can't say anything, it's in your subconscious and it's just locked in there because for years and years and years, that's the way that it's been. No, I agree with you on that point.
The more we're talking, the more I'm like, how many things need to be changed before women of color, of a marginalized background, can feel truly comfortable living here?
So much needs to change. There's a lot that needs to be broken down and rebuilt, and that itself will take years.
So, speaking of Caravana, you mentioned that there were some positive aspects. So, eating together, dancing together. What could be a better version of Caravana if it were to change and become a better representation for the Caribbean islands?
Maybe something where we learn about the history of the countries that are participating. Let's say for me, I've grown up in Canada. I was never really immersed in culture or the history as much as I could have been, like why certain things are being done the way they are, so that everyone has the opportunity to really learn about the history of the islands and their feats to liberation and so forth.
That sounds like a great start. Educate the population.
Exactly. My grandpa always said that knowledge is power.
Your grandpa is a wise, wise man. Have you ever been to any Caribbean islands before?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I only went once when I was 10 and it was for a family reunion to Trinidad. We were there for 3 days only, but it was, I would say, the most beautiful trip or anything that we'd ever done in our entire lives. It's an absolutely beautiful island. We were on the beach any moment we could be.
Do you have any memories of any culture shocks you might have had there, or something that just stood out to you as really different from life in Toronto?
Well, the food is a lot cleaner and healthier. They've got like like chickens in the backyard and they go and cut it up and then you eat. Eating that food, it felt so different because the food here, I don't know, it almost feels fake compared to when you're eating like real food. And I actually felt sick because I wasn't used to it.
From the fresh food?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's a first.
Yeah, I know.
When I went to Pakistan, I don't know if this is universal. We ate the food there and then we weren't feeling well, but the reason was because the food there was not clean.
Oh,
I thought that was the reason, but now, after speaking to you, maybe it's just because our bodies are just not used to eating anything besides this ultra-processed junk.
yeah.
Crazy that there's so many human beings being fed a non-human diet.
I know, it's disgusting when you think about what they're putting into our food.
So you mentioned fresh and clean food over there. I'm curious about what specific dishes from Trinidad did you have, or are there any specific cultural dishes that you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. So mainly curry chicken and roti. And I knew that's very similar to India. We adopted that. Something unique, I would say, is doubles, and it's bread stuffed with chickpeas and potatoes, and you can have it spicy or not, and then it's fried. That is so delicious. And aloo pie as well. It's essentially the same thing as the doubles, but with just potatoes. Amazing.
In South Asia, we call potatoes aloo.
That sort of adoption of language and culture. Yeah. Tomatoes choka it's also just the way that they make the tomatoes. It's like fried down, and my mom usually would bake it first and then fry it down. It's just really a tomato. Not to downplay, but like that's the way that I can really get down to the basic of it.
Is it a side dish?
No, you can just eat that as a main dish, usually with roti.
Oh, okay, interesting. What about any cultural clothing?
Yeah, again, going back to that adoption of culture, Trinis also wear saris, which I know is very common in India. When I was visiting, it's a hot country, right? So it's like shorts, t-shirts, really basic. And then culturally, just like I know of the sari.
Do you know on which type of occasion a sari would be worn?
Definitely weddings, maybe birthdays. When we had that big family reunion get-together, everyone was actually just dressed in plain clothing. But for big events like that, like a wedding, definitely a sari would be worn.
And is a sari something that the bride would wear or just the guests in general?
Bride, guests, everyone, really, the women, yeah.
I love that. What about for the men? Do they have anything special that they wear to weddings?
From what I recall, I don't know what like the name of the attire is, but it's almost like a dress and then pants under it. And then that also would tie into religion, because I know on my mom's side, that family member specifically was Muslim, and that was typically what a Muslim man would wear.
Okay.
Yeah, I just don't know the name of it, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm sure afterwards, if you find a picture of it, we can post that, and then people can check it out on our Instagram and see.
For sure.
You mentioned music at the start, and you said that was a really big part of how you're connected to the culture. So
Definitely.
Do you have any artists that you could shout out and what type of music they make from that area?
Like growing up as a kid, we listened to so much soca and chutney music. Right now, I actually don't listen to any, so I don't have anyone to shout out, but just go ahead and look up soca music. There will be so many artists that come up. But DJing was a big part. Growing up, there were so many uncles I had that did DJing. Like, that's a really big part of it, especially when it comes to like little festivals and get-togethers. You've always got that one uncle that he's a DJ on the side and he puts together everything for you. Yeah, so childhood me definitely maybe would have had an answer for you, but right now I don't.
That's fine. We'll look into it afterwards and find something. What kind of music are these?
Have you ever heard the steel pan?
Yes.
That instrument, so there's a lot of that in there. It's very upbeat, it can be very fast-paced. It's like kind of party dance music, and then you'll find songs that have very deep lyrical meaning when it comes to like, you know, talking about maybe the struggle or just relating to home life, growing up with your parents. But from like what I remember hearing growing up, it was a lot of like very upbeat tones that you can really dance to.
Sounds like you had a lot of fun events growing up to attend.
Somewhat.
I'm also curious because we also have some cultural gatherings, but I feel like we're not really able to blast music like that just because of the neighbors. So if you have like so many uncles that were DJing and playing all this music, where would you guys hold these events?
Oh my god, Trinis don't care. They're gonna blast that music. Yeah, no. Even my mom, just being home alone, she would be blasting music on her own in the apartment, and you can hear it from down the hall. So yeah, they don't care about the neighbors.
If you guys never got complaints, it means that everyone had good taste.
That's true.
finally, are there any spots in Toronto that you know of that have really good Trini food or Dominica or Guyanese or just any any of those countries in that area?
My grandma's kitchen. We like to eat at home a lot. I love to watch her make the dishes and participate in that with her because it creates this deeper sense of connection when you're cooking with someone. But yeah, shout out to my grandma because she actually does sell roti and she makes pepper sauce and sells it.
Oh, no way. We can totally
Yeah,
promote that. Does she have like a business website?
no, it's just really right out of the kitchen.
And also, do you have any specialties then that you can cook?
I'm so basic. Like, I love making pasta. That has nothing to do with the culture.
Maybe you can experiment with adding a little Trini twist in it.
Absolutely, I'll consider that.
Alrighty, Tasia, this was an amazing interview. I just want to thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I learned that there's a country called Dominica in the world. So
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I was honored to be on here and share what I can, and I'm really proud of what you're doing. Thank you.
Aw, thank you so much. Is there any way to say bye from the Caribbean?
You know, well, if we were in person, I would just give you a hug.
Okay, I'll take that. Virtual hug. Thank you so much again, Tasia.
You take care.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Hand the Mic Over. And as always, you can find us on Spotify and YouTube and find us on Instagram at Hand the Mic Over.